A warm welcome to these training materials to help you support our refugee children in school. This was originally presented to and shaped by staff in Suffolk schools who wanted to learn more about trauma, resilience, and the most effective ways to share best practice. There follows a short presentation that explores the context of this work and the particular stresses and trauma that refugee children and their families face. We'll talk you through some simple things to look out for and how you can offer very practical support and help children rebuild a protective shield within your school. At the end, there are lots of useful resources, including an audit tool for your setting and further reading and videos to watch and share. Before we start, we'd like to offer a gentle reminder that adulthood is not a trauma-free destination. Many of us will have experienced trauma or adverse experiences both inside and outside of our work context. Please do be kind to yourself, notice any feelings that this topic may raise for you, and take a break at any time you need to. Despite sometimes living through decades of conflict and hardship, our refugee children and families can demonstrate a remarkable resilience and sense of hope. However, when they suddenly arrive in an unfamiliar place, in temporary accommodation, their future at that point is unknowable, and they are very vulnerable and isolated. In the context of recent war and conflict, our refugee children and young people have frequently had very little time to prepare for such huge changes to their circumstances. Where this is the case, they may be grieving for their past lives, anxious about those left behind, and finding it hard to adapt to novelty. Physically, they are likely to be overwhelmed and overtired, easily triggered by minor stresses and noises, experiencing sudden engulfing emotions, and their sleeping patterns are also likely to be impacted, adding to their difficulties and fatigue. Young people who have reflected on their arrival in the UK say that they just felt so scared and shy. They needed time to speak up and to begin to move beyond the embarrassment of mispronouncing words. They reported very low self-esteem and were helped by activities that didn't need too much language, but just helped people to get to know them better. The young people have explained that what they needed most was for people just to listen, to take the time to care, and to give the space for them to speak up and explain the treasures that they have inside them.
Something that distinguishes many refugee children and students from other children who have suffered trauma is that they're often subject to additional risk factors, which we call core stressors. The main core stressors are traumatic stress, resettlement stress, acculturation stress, and isolation stress. And I'll go through those four now for you. The refugee experience can be extremely traumatic. In the home country, children and students may have witnessed violence as either witnesses, victims, or occasionally perpetrators. They have gone through war. They've had a lack of food, water, and shelter. They may have experienced physical injuries. They may have experienced torture, forced labour, sexual assault, the loss of loved ones, and the disruption in or a lack of access to schooling. During displacement, there is also a huge potential for trauma. Children may be living in refugee camps. They may have separation from their family, a loss of community, and real uncertainty about their future. They may have travelled long distances by foot, and they may also have experienced detention. On top of that potential traumatic stress, other core stresses include resettlement stress. And those are the stresses that refugee children and their families experience as they try to make a new life for themselves. There are lots of resettlement stress factors. Examples include financial stresses, difficulties finding adequate housing, difficulties finding employment, a huge loss of community support, a real lack of access to resources, and transportation difficulties as well, adding to the isolation that they may feel. Another stress factor is acculturation, and this is a stress that refugee children and their families experience as they try to navigate between their new culture and their culture of origin. So various examples of these include conflicts between children and parents over new and old cultural views, conflicts with peers that can happen in school related to cultural misunderstandings, the necessity of translation needs for family members who are not fluent in English, problems trying to fit in a new school, and a real struggle to try and form an integrated identity, which includes aspects of their new culture and their culture of origin. Isolation stress is also a major factor. These are the stressors that refugee children and families experience as minorities in a new country. So examples of this include feelings of loneliness and loss of a social support network, the experience of discrimination, potential harassment from peers, adults, or law enforcement agencies, experiences with others who do not trust the refugee child and family, that feeling of not fitting in with others, and for many refugees, a real loss of social status.
Challenges to children and young people's well-being include a range of things that might have happened to them. For example, traumatic experiences in their country of origin, but also on their journey and on their arrival to the UK. As already mentioned, they are likely to be holding unprocessed feelings of grief and anxiety and feeling isolated and lonely. In the classroom, you could see these challenges manifest as fight, flight, or freeze responses, as distanced, disconnection, or withdrawal. Young people might seem more tired and have difficulty staying awake and alert or processing the emotions of others, or they might be hypervigilant and visibly distressed, needing safe spaces to co-regulate and feel calmer.
When we are thinking about trauma, one way we can think about it is to think about the 3 E's, which are events, experience of event, and effect. If we take the first one, which is the event, so these are the events and circumstances which may include the actual or extreme threat of physical or psychological harm. So that might be natural disasters or violence, etc. Or it can also be severe life-threatening neglect for a child that puts their healthy development at risk. These events and circumstances may occur as a single occurrence or repeatedly over time. The second E is the experience of the event. So the individual's experience of an event helps to determine whether it's traumatic for them. An event might be traumatic for one person and not for another. And how the person labels the event and what happens to them in terms of how they're affected by it physically and psychologically will contribute to whether it's experienced as traumatic. Lots of traumatic events set up a kind of power imbalance, whereby one person or an entity, an event, has power over another. So that leads to lots of questioning of why me. And a person's experience is shaped by this powerlessness and questioning. So you can often have lots of negative feelings about humiliation, guilt and shame, and they're often involved and they shape the experience of the event. How the event is experienced might be linked to several factors, for example, social support, cultural beliefs, the resiliency factors that you've already got, or the developmental stage of the person. The last E is effect. Long-lasting negative effects are a critical component of trauma. So they might occur immediately, or they might have a delayed onset. So you might start seeing things like withdrawal or hypervigilance. And the duration can be short to long term. Sometimes the person won't even make the link between the event and the effect. It's also important to remember that children experiencing the same trauma will experience it completely differently, even in the same family. What's really important to remember is that we're not asking teachers to be trauma detectives. You don't need to know what happened to show up and care for the children that you're working with. But it can be helpful if we know a little bit about some of the symptoms that we might see after someone has experienced trauma. The key ones can be categorised in 3 ways: avoidance, arousal, and changed thinking. Let's take avoidance first. So avoidance is the avoidance of reminders, either internal or external, of the traumatic experience. Dissociation can also play a role here. So dissociation means that you really switch off. It's as though you're engaged in an automatic activity and you lose contact with your immediate environment. It can be a protective element during really severe stress or trauma. For example, you might see things like fixed or glazed eyes in the child, long periods of silence. Their responses might not be congruent with the present context or situation. So dissociation can happen after severe trauma. You might see changed behaviours. So you might see a real withdrawal, maybe from activities that the child used to enjoy before, or from friends and family as well. For some children, particularly for adolescents, substance misuse might be used as a way of trying to avoid reminders of the trauma. And sometimes the adults around them might not make the link between their past trauma and the risky behaviours that they're doing now. Arousal is another concept that we might see after trauma. So for example, with high arousal, you might see angry outbursts, you might see anxiety, poor sleep, hypervigilance, self-injury, and taking new risks. The last aspect that we can look at is the idea of changed thinking. So after we've experienced a traumatic event, sometimes we develop a real bias towards seeing the world as unsafe and threatening now. And it can have a real impact on our belief in ourselves, about how well we can cope with things, about how well we can have control over our environment. Sometimes we will start reliving the event. And we can also have real concentration and memory difficulties as well. So avoidance, arousal, and changed thinking are all things that we might see after trauma.
All children need relationships to thrive. Traumatized children need relationships to heal. Your schools can be a secure base to begin to create loving connections. Adults can demonstrate safety and dependability to contain the emotions that the young person is not yet able to, and to begin to demonstrate relationships that are healthy and reliable. They can give daily nurture, consistency, and an experience of secure, unconditional attachment.
There's been lots of research done by psychologists to look at what factors help support recovery after difficult life events or traumatic events. One of the key pieces of research came out of research done by Stephen Hobful in about 2007. And he and others were looking at what is needed to help recovery after trauma caused by huge disasters, for example, Hurricane Katrina or the Twin Towers disaster. And all the research that they did came up with 5 key principles. And these were the principles that they felt really helped to support the recovery. So let's take these principles one by one. Safety is the first principle. So for those children who've experienced trauma, the adults and the school building itself, the school setting, form an emotionally secure base where they can be listened to and valued. So they've got a sense of emotional and physical safety there. And that's really important. That's a key factor. The second principle is calm. So it's about helping to support children manage their emotions and stay calm, even when they're feeling very dysregulated. The next principle is a sense of control. So children need to feel that they've got some kind of control over what's happening to them, and a belief that their actions are likely to lead to generally positive outcomes for them. Connectedness is the next principle. It's really important that adults and children and young people feel that they have a sense of belonging and that they have a social network that can support them within the educational setting. And the last principle is hope. So it's really important to communicate to the children that you're working with that, yes, while things might feel really difficult at the moment, things will get better. They will start feeling better and things will start to work out in the future. And they need to be provided with reassurance that they can, in the long term, feel positive again. And it's also important for us to remember that for a lot of other cultures, there is a religious element to the concept of hope as well. So we need to bear that in mind as well. So the 5 key principles that support recovery are safety, calmness, sense of control, connectedness, and hope.
In their earliest years, children are vulnerable, and it's hard for them to estimate danger or to intervene to protect themselves. They are reliant on their adult caretakers. We term this a protective shield, which is provided by others. The emotional and physical toil of war and conflict and subsequent displacement to unfamiliar places erodes this feeling of adult protection, trust, and safety. Through the careful, attuned, and compassionate responses to refugee children, we as practitioners have a significant role to play in helping them to build or rebuild their protective shields, grow their resilience and hope, and not just survive, but really thrive in their new circumstances.
We'd like to thank you for listening to this presentation and hope that it has been informative and useful. There are a range of resources that have been created to accompany the training. For instance, you can access the audit tool to provide a comprehensive picture of what your school is currently doing to support students and families of refugee backgrounds, to identify the school's strengths and areas for whole school improvement, and guide whole school action planning. There is also the infographic to provide a summary of the training content and reflections from attendees. Moreover, we will be signposting to a variety of reading materials and videos, which includes the Padlet link, where you'll be able to find an array of information that we plan to continue to add to.